Welcome to another in our series of videos about scholarly habits for Greek exegesis. Our habit that we're focusing on is how to do scholarly debates regarding Greek words in the New Testament. We call this scholarly debates in Greek word studies. Now, we're looking specifically on the methods of creating a Greek word study. And the first method we're going to look at is various outlines that are appropriate. Greek word study is a very formalized approach. You have a 4 to 5 page limit. It's a fixed format using exact resources, and we'll discuss 3 different forms. Really, the forms are based on 2 different formats. The first format is from Dr. Sara Wells. Dr. Wells uses a format with 1 Greek lexicon, 1 theological dictionary, and 1 commentary. You have in it perhaps an introduction, perhaps you just use the introduction in the first section. The first section is defining the word. You identify the word, the word that you're going to study, and perhaps you identify the paragraph in the chapter. But you go on from that point to look at the lexicon entry, and you discuss the background of the term learned from the Theological Dictionary. This is called the common language in Verbrugge. And then you synthesize it. So again, the first thing you do is you look at perhaps Thayer's lexicon and you summarize it in 2 paragraphs. Then you discuss the background of the term learned from Theological Dictionary. That's how it was commonly used in Greek. And you perhaps put 2 paragraphs in. No more than 2 paragraphs if you can be shorter. Word studies are concise instruments. Then you provide a synthesis in 1 to 2 sentences. So notice you introduce it in 1 to 2 sentences in defining word, and you close it in 1 to 2 sentences. Now the next thing is the New Testament use of the scripture. You would go ahead and look at the term in the lexicons or the Theological Dictionary to see where it's used in the New Testament. In Verbrugge, he will discuss how it's used in the New Testament, and you can provide that. For myself, I sometimes ask people if there's a specific edition where you might refer back to the Old Testament. You can refer back to the Old Testament with the LXX, which is the Septuagint. The reason is the Greek used in the Septuagint is very close to the New Testament Greek. But the most important part in the New Testament use of the term is really how you actually look at the term in the New Testament scriptures. Usually it takes you a good 2 to 4 paragraphs to cover that. Only in special cases would you refer back to Old Testament usage. If you think your word is one of those words that might benefit from that, do contact me. I'm glad to chat with you. Then in the 3rd paragraph, the title says, and by the way, the titles are specific, defining the word, the New Testament use of the term, interpreting the term. Now in this case, you put the term in and the specific scripture. You don't just study the general word, but you study a specific term. You discuss at that point what you learned about the term from sections 1 and 2, that is, defining the word through the lexicon or Verbrugge's information in the Theological Dictionary and the New Testament scriptures. And then it informs how you interpret it. Then you discuss other things, the literary context, the cultural context, and key issues in the passage. If you look at a commentary, it can usually provide you this information. Again, all of this discussion in A is probably a short 1 to 2 paragraphs. That is, discussing what we learned about the terms. That should be a very short paragraph, a summary of the synthesis between Section 1 and Section 2. Then the Part B, which is a much more substantial part, will talk about the literary context, the key issues. That's probably 1 to 2 paragraphs. So you have 1 paragraph in A. I've left it blank because some people can do it in 4 or 5 sentences. Some people need a little longer. Then you come to the final conclusion. What does the scripture mean to you as a reader today? You might share insights. You might share specific applications to contemporary Christianity. One thing I recommend is when you're discussing the literary terms in the New Testament, you decide if it's a specific theological piece of knowledge or if it's general. Many are general, but there are some cases, such as women wearing veils, that many scholars consider are specific. Well, let's go on to Dr. Story's. Dr. Story does this a little different. He has one set of paragraphs for the lexicon where you identify the Greek term, the verse, the paragraph, and the chapter. That's 1 to 2 sentences. Then you summarize the lexicon entry. This might be Thayer's, in 1 to 2 paragraphs. It is at that point you summarize what the lexicon says about the Old Testament and the New Testament scriptures that are described with the lexicon. Then you provide a synthesis and 3 to 4 sentences about what the lexicon uses. Then you interpret the word. That is, interpreting the word using a theological dictionary. That theological dictionary will have, as mentioned in Dr. Wells' section, a common language definition, Old Testament usage, and New Testament. You need about 2 paragraphs to summarize one. Then you have a synthesis of the sources. That's a compare and contrast the lexicon information with the theological dictionary. And then at the end, summarize what you've learned. Now here's where Dr. Story's also changes. He wants you to integrate the definition and the interpreting with the examination using Inductive Bible Study Techniques into the context of your paragraph. He wants you to place the verse in the paragraph in the book. By doing that, you provide an introduction of the book. Say if it's John and it's John first 1, John opens the gospel by describing who Jesus was. John 1:1 says in the beginning, and then you go from there. You describe, in that I've described the book, I've described where the pericope falls, and then you look for 5 literary relationships in the pericope. After you discuss this, you probably have a good idea of what the pericope, that is the paragraph or multiple lines inside of the book, provide around the word. Then you place the summary from section 2 into the context. You describe what it means and why it's important, and you compare this with commentaries. Notice in Dr. Story's, your commentary work, your using of other resources other than scholarly insight, is placed to the 3rd. Then again, in the application, you say, is it general truth or is it specific to a certain circumstances today? You apply what it means to today's life and your ministry. Notice, all the rest of this is 3rd person until you get to the application. Do not provide a single person that says this is what happens in Dr. Story's until the application. Now let's look at multiple sources. Let's take Dr. Story's outline as he provides for that. Again, you have the introduction with the Greek word, verse, paragraph, in the chapter. This can be as part of your first opening sentences in defining the word, or you can provide a first 1 to 2 lines that lays out your paper's outline. Then you define the word and you look at the BDAG entry, and the Thayer entry. Notice the BDAG entry is given first because it's considered more authoritative, more recent than the Thayer entry. This includes both the definition and New Testament sources. Then you compare and contrast it. Now in the second section, you interpret the word. By that you look at the Theological Dictionary's interpretation of the word. You summarize the Kittel's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament in 1 paragraph. You summarize Verbrugge's in a paragraph. And if you use a 3rd dictionary, you summarize it in a short paragraph. And then you synthesize it. You look at how TDNT relates to the BDAG and Thayer Exegetical. You look at how ISBE relates to BDAG. And you summarize what you've learned. Now, again, You've now looked at two sets of scholarly sources, a defining a word and a theological dictionary which interprets the word. You go to the context of the paragraph by placing it, the placement of the verse in the pericope in the book. For Matthew's first chapter, you might look at the genealogies and place that within the book and describe what happens before and after. Then there's the literary relationships, 5 relationships around the word. Use your IBS techniques to discover that. Then you place the summary into that context, give an overall discussion of the word in that context, give meaning and importance. At this point, you may look at 2 commentaries. Then, how does this conviction, for example, help us to understand faith? How does the conviction found in a particular statement help us understand God's approval? You know, we are getting to an application of a specific discussion. Well, I hope this has helped you. The next thing we'll do is we'll dive into looking at Thayer's lexicon and creating an outline for word study and discussion. That is, we're going to look at Thayer's lexicon and discuss how we take all that information and make a short paragraph that summarizes it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting with you again as we look at Thayer's lexicon.